The Netherlands has just declared open war on the money funding its own mosques. In 2018, investigators traced over 30 million euros flowing from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar into Dutch Islamic institutions since 2013, including one Rotterdam mosque flagged as a security risk. Now, a 2024 coalition government is drafting a law forcing every foreign religious gift above 4,500 euros into a public register, or banning it outright. So how do you stop hostile money without treating an entire faith like a suspect? That question sits at the center of a security assessment Dutch intelligence had already been building for years, folder by folder, wire transfer by wire transfer. Findings linked to the AIVD, the Dutch General Intelligence and Security Service, covered roughly 30 mosques and foundations that had received money from Gulf sources by 2018. A network large enough that intelligence analysts stopped calling it charity and started calling it infrastructure. The AIVD had already made part of that picture public 2 years later in its 2020 report on Salafist influence titled Kwetsbaar voor Extremisme, which named specific institutions rather than speaking only in generalities. One of them was the Al-Fitra Islamic Center in Utrecht, whose preaching had already drawn police attention years earlier. The report ran to dozens of pages, cataloging named institutions rather than relying on an anonymous tally. What alarmed AIVD analysts wasn't the funding's existence. It was the total absence of anyone in the Netherlands keeping count. Investigators treated the money as a channel, a way for foreign governments to buy religious and political influence inside a NATO and EU member state using nothing more exotic than a bank transfer. No embassy required, no visible diplomat, just a wire that could shape which imam preached, which curriculum got taught. Interior Minister Kastja Ollongren, whose portfolio includes oversight of the AIVD, gave the conclusion an official name. She called the funding sources unwelcome, a diplomatic word doing the work of an undiplomatic accusation. It carries diplomatic weight, and the government used it anyway. The traced money since 2013 had already crossed 30 million euros. Not a single suspicious wire. A sustained, years-long current running straight through the country's religious institutions. A sustained, years-long current running straight through the country's religious institutions didn't start in 2013, and it didn't start with any intention to interfere. It started because Dutch Muslim communities could not afford to build their own mosques. Guest workers arrived from Turkey and Morocco through the 1970s and into the 1980s, recruited to staff factories and shipyards, expected by everyone, including themselves, to eventually go home. The Netherlands had signed a formal labor recruitment agreement with Turkey in 1964, followed by a similar treaty with Morocco in 1969, and both treated the arrangement as strictly temporary. Housing and religious infrastructure were never written into the deal. They prayed in converted garages and rented back rooms, sent most of their wages back to families abroad, and had no capital left over to construct anything permanent. Turkey's state, religious authority, the Diyanet, stepped into that gap and never really left. Today it oversees roughly 140 Dutch mosques through a federation called ISN, appointing and paying many of the imams who lead prayers inside them. ISN itself was founded in 1982, formalizing a relationship between Ankara and Dutch mosques that had already existed informally for most of the previous decade. A second Turkish-linked network, Milli Görüş, built its own parallel presence, historically closer to political Islam than to Ankara's official line. Gulf Charities did the same on the Salafist and conservative end of the spectrum, funding mosques that answered to Riyadh's or Kuwait's religious establishment. For decades, it was simply how mosques in the Netherlands got built, documented in planning permits and municipal records. The arrangement worked well enough for 40 years that nobody in The Hague had reason to ask who was paying for it. The dependency the AIVD flagged in 2018 wasn't a scandal that appeared overnight. It was the bill coming due on a 40-year arrangement nobody had ever renegotiated because nobody in power had ever been forced to. Nobody was forced to reckon with that arrangement until one mosque made it impossible to look away from. Rotterdam's As Soena Mosque went up in the 1990s, funded by Kuwait's Al-Waqf al-Islami, also known as the Direct Aid Society, one of the same Gulf charities intelligence services would later flag by name. The mosque opened its doors in 1993 in the Afrikanderwijk neighborhood, and within a decade it had grown into one of the largest in the country, drawing several thousand worshippers on a given Friday. Rotterdam's municipal government had approved the construction decades earlier. For years, it operated like any other large urban congregation. Prayer services, community classes, a visible minaret over a working-class Rotterdam neighborhood. Then Dutch intelligence started flagging it for a rotation of Salafist preachers whose sermons alarmed security services enough to keep the mosque under active, sustained watch. Its longtime imam, the Syrian-born Fawaz Naid, was put on trial in 2014 over a sermon prosecutors said crossed into anti-Semitic hate speech. A Dutch court acquitted him in 2016, ruling the remarks fell inside the bounds of religious speech. The concern wasn't the building or the worshippers filling it. It was the pipeline of visiting speakers, funded and vetted abroad, delivering a version of Islam far more rigid than anything most Dutch Muslims had grown up with. They denied extremist wrongdoing, insisting the mosque served an ordinary congregation, not a staging ground for ideology. But the association stuck. As Soena became shorthand, the case officials reached for whenever they needed to explain, in one sentence, why foreign-funded mosques deserved a second look. That second look got a lot more rigorous in April 2018, when Nieuwsuur and NRC Handelsblad published a joint investigation that turned suspicion into documented fact. The reporters spent months tracing bank records, foundation filings, and court documents across 3 countries. The investigation reproduced underlying wire transfer and foundation filing records rather than relying on anonymous sourcing, naming individual recipient institutions instead of describing the funding only in the aggregate. The reporting traced 30 million euros flowing into Dutch Islamic institutions since 2013, much of it moving through channels linked to Kuwait's Al-Waqf al-Islami, the same organization behind As Soena's original construction money decades earlier. The investigation didn't allege that every euro funded radicalization. It didn't need to. What it showed was scale. Untracked, unregulated money moving through a system with no reporting requirement and no oversight body watching where any of it landed. Individual municipalities knew about individual mosques. No one in The Hague had ever added up the whole picture until 2 newsrooms did the work the state hadn't. Parliament could no longer treat the mosque funding question as a fringe concern once 2 of the country's most credible newsrooms had put a number on it in black and white. For a government that likes to think of itself as transparent and in control of its own borders, that absence of a paper trail was its own kind of scandal. Its own kind of scandal demanded its own kind of response, and the government tried to deliver one fast. In a November 2018 letter to Parliament, Minister Ollongren went further than she had before, naming Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar directly as sources of unwelcome funding, a level of specificity Dutch ministers rarely commit to paper about allied Gulf states. It read like the opening move of a crackdown, the kind of letter that promises legislation within the year. Then the government hit a wall. Article 6 of the Dutch Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, and no existing law gave the state power to block a private foreign donation to a religious organization because officials disapproved of where the money originated. You cannot regulate a gift out of existence by writing a strongly worded letter. The ministers could name names in Parliament. They could not stop a single euro from crossing the border in practice. The letter had named the disease. It still had no prescription for treating it. That prescription-shaped hole is what the cabinet set out to fill next, unable to stop the money directly, and it landed on transparency instead of outright prohibition. Civil servants who had watched the 2018 letter go nowhere wanted something that would actually hold up the second. A lawyer challenged it. The Ministry of the Interior drafted the Wet Transparency Maatschappelijke Organisaties, the WTMO, a law built around disclosure rather than a ban, on the theory that sunlight might do what a constitutional prohibition could not. Comparable disclosure laws already existed elsewhere in Europe and beyond, giving the drafters a template to point to. Austria's 2015 Islam Gesetz had already banned foreign funding of imams and mosques outright, a model Dutch drafters studied and explicitly chose not to copy, since Austria's law had drawn years of legal challenges over its discriminatory intent. The threshold was set at 4,500 euros. Any foreign gift above that line would have to be reported, named, and dated. Public consultation on the bill opened in November 2023, inviting the scrutiny that had been missing from the mosque cases for years. Crucially, the drafters didn't write a mosque law, or even a religion law. They wrote a civil society law, applying the same disclosure rule to every NGO and foundation in the country, environmental groups, human rights charities, sports clubs with foreign sponsors, not just religious institutions. On paper, it solved the constitutional problem cleanly. Nobody could accuse the state of singling out one faith when the exact same rule applied to everyone raising foreign money for any cause at all. Applying to everyone on paper is not the same as landing on everyone in practice, and the Council of State said so bluntly. The Radvan States Advisory Report on the WTMO questioned whether the law was even proportionate to the problem it claimed to solve, the question that can quietly kill legislation in the Netherlands. It found no evidence of foreign interference reaching beyond the mosque cases already documented by Newsor and NRC. No hidden wave of comparable money moving through secular or Christian organizations that might justify a nationwide disclosure regime. More pointedly, the Council's report flagged what critics had suspected. Whatever its neutral-sounding language, the practical weight of the law would fall on Islamic organizations, because they were the only groups the government had actually built a documented case against. The comparison was hard to miss. The kind of foreign agent registration law authoritarian states use to brand dissidents and minorities as tools of hostile powers. A law drawn broad enough to avoid looking discriminatory can still land narrow enough to be discriminatory in effect. That kind of advisory finding doesn't kill a bill outright in the Dutch system, but ignoring it invites exactly the courtroom loss the government was trying to engineer its way around. The Council of State said the quiet part out loud, on the record, in an official government document. Saying the quiet part out loud didn't end the objections, it multiplied them almost immediately. The contact organ Moslems on Overheid, the CMO, the main coordinating body linking Dutch Muslim organizations to the state, formally objected to the WTMO, arguing it treated an entire religious community as a standing security concern rather than a population of ordinary citizens. Amnesty International Netherlands raised its own concerns about the bill's scope, warning that a disclosure threshold this low would sweep in routine, harmless generosity along with anything genuinely worth investigating. Both organizations made the same underlying argument in different words. A law written to catch bad actors was, in its current form, wide enough to catch almost everyone else too. The examples critics reached for weren't hypothetical scare stories dreamed up for a press release, a relative abroad wiring money for a leaking mosque roof, a diaspora community pooling small donations for Ramadan food aid. Neither transaction resembles the Gulf-funded influence campaigns the AIVD had spent years tracking, and both would now sit inside the same public register, filed next to whatever the AIVD was worried about, with no way for an outside observer scrolling through the database to tell the difference between the two. No way to tell the difference stopped mattering to a large slice of Dutch voters, and the election results made that plain almost overnight. Geert Wilders' PVV won the November 22nd, 2023 election with 37 seats, the largest single bloc in a fragmented parliament, running in part on a promise to get tougher on exactly this issue. His PVV formed a government with the VVD, the New Social Contract Party, and the Farmer Citizen Movement, four parties with little else in common beyond a shared appetite for restricting foreign influence. The VVD had taken 24 seats, New Social Contract 20, and the Farmer Citizen Movement just 4, a coalition built less on shared ideology than on the arithmetic needed to reach a majority in the 150-seat Tweede Kamer. The coalition talks that followed dragged on for months, but when the four governing parties signed their Hoofdlijnenakkoord on May 16, 2024, the mosque funding fight had moved from advisory reports and newspaper investigations into binding, written government policy. The agreement committed explicitly to banning unwanted foreign funding of mosques and Islamic schools, language considerably blunter than anything the previous cabinet had put in writing. What had been a slow-moving transparency bill, built to survive constitutional scrutiny, now had a harder political mandate behind it, one built on a campaign promise rather than a careful legal proof of proportionality. Those two things were about to collide. And that collision became the actual fight. A campaign promise and a legal proof of proportionality are not the same instrument, and the gap between them is where lawyers earn their fees. Through 2024 and into 2025, the WTMO's legislative process kept grinding forward, but it collided head-on with Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which protects freedom of religion across every member state, and which Dutch courts have never treated as optional. European courts have struck down blunter instruments before, when governments tried to legislate against a religion instead of against specific, provable conduct. Could the government simply ban funding by naming a country or naming a faith? Or did it have to prove, case by case, institution by institution, that a specific gift posed a specific, demonstrable danger? Legal advisors pushed hard for the second option, arguing for individualized, undesirable funding designations rather than blanket bans on entire nationalities or entire religions. That distinction sounds bureaucratic, almost pedantic. It is actually the whole ballgame. The difference between a law that survives a courtroom challenge at the European Court of Human Rights and one that gets struck down the first time somebody with standing decides to sue. Struck down the first time somebody sues is exactly what the government was trying to avoid, and the version of the WTMO that ultimately survived shows the caution. The Foreign Gift Register now runs through the Dutch Chamber of Commerce, the KVK, the same body that already handles corporate and foundation filings, folding the new disclosure requirement into infrastructure that already existed. The KVK already maintains filings for more than 2 million registered organizations, giving the new register an existing search interface rather than a database built from scratch. Any foreign gift above the reporting threshold becomes public information, searchable by anyone, not buried in a file only officials can request. And the power to actually intervene stayed narrower than the original 2024 coalition language had promised. The state can block funding only when it can point to demonstrated anti-democratic conduct tied to that specific money, not because of the donor's nationality, and not because of the recipient's religion. It's a slower, less satisfying tool than the blanket ban Wilder's coalition had promised voters. Critics who wanted an outright ban called it toothless. Officials who had read the Council of State's warning called it the only version likely to survive its first legal test. It's also the version built to withstand a constitutional and European human rights challenge instead of losing one in a courtroom within months of passage. Withstanding a challenge instead of losing one was never really the end goal, just the mechanism for a much bigger ambition sitting underneath the mosque story the whole time. The WTMO framework doesn't stop at Islamic organizations. Whatever headline first put it on the public's radar. It's built to catch foreign-linked cultural associations, advocacy groups, any foreign government quietly using a Dutch nonprofit as a foothold, whether the money originates in the Gulf, Ankara, Beijing, or Moscow. Officials now describe the whole effort under a broader label, Ongewenste buitenlands inmenging, unwanted foreign interference, a policy umbrella that treats the mosque funding cases as the opening chapter of a much longer story. That reframing mattered politically too. A law about foreign interference is much harder to paint as an attack on one community than a law with a mosque in its title. Mosques became the first visible test case because they were the first cases anyone had actually documented in enough detail to build a law around. The transparency fight itself was always going to outlast the headlines about Kuwait and Qatar because the underlying question, who gets to fund influence inside Dutch civil society, was never really about one religion to begin with. Follow the money, not the faith. That is the line the Netherlands landed on after 6 years of investigations, failed bans, and constitutional pushback. A country can demand to see where religious money comes from without deciding in advance that one religion is guilty of taking it. That is not a small shift for a country that spent 2 decades treating this as someone else's problem. The mosques built on Gulf and Turkish money back in the 1970s aren't going anywhere, and neither is foreign interest in Dutch civil society. What changes now is whether anyone, journalist, regulator, or ordinary citizen, can actually see the money moving instead of finding out about it 5 years late from a newspaper investigation. If stories like this help you make sense of the world, stick around for that.